He was the charming cowboy in Maverick, the wisecracking detective in the Rockford Files, and a Hollywood icon who never played by the rules. But behind James Garner's laid-back grin was a life few truly knew. A man who built a career on honesty and heart carried silent burdens far from the spotlight. His elegant Brentwood home stood quiet and untouched for years, a symbol of a life full of both triumph and solitude. What really happened in those final years? Why was his beloved sanctuary left behind like a forgotten chapter? Garner's journey wasn't just about fame. It was about love tested, battles endured, and a legacy quietly built on resilience. As we uncover the layers of his remarkable life, we'll reveal the man behind the myth, flawed, faithful, and unforgettable. This is the untold story of James Garner and the secrets he left behind. Long before James Garner became a household name, he was just a kid from Norman, Oklahoma, weathering a rough upbringing during the Great Depression. Born James Scott Bumgarner in 1928, his early life was shaped more by hardship than Hollywood dreams. He faced the loss of his mother at a young age, endured a series of challenging home environments, and found himself drifting from job to job as a young man. Everything from a gas station attendant to a merchant marine. Acting wasn't even on his radar. In fact, it found him by accident. It was in Los Angeles, after a stint in the Korean War, that left him both wounded and decorated, where Garner stumbled into an acting class, mostly to meet women. But something unexpected happened. He didn't just fit in, he stood out. Natural, understated, and effortlessly authentic, Garner had a presence the camera loved. He didn't perform so much as he existed in front of the lens. No exaggeration, no pretense, just a quiet strength and a twinkle of charm that audiences instantly connected with. His breakthrough came in the late 1950s with the role of Brett Maverick, a gambler with a conscience, in the hit television Western Maverick. Garner wasn't the typical tough-talking gunslinger. He brought humor, wit, and a sense of reluctant heroism that made him relatable. Maverick didn't want trouble, but he could handle it if it came. That subtle balance of likability and edge became Garner's trademark. From there, Hollywood took notice. Garner transitioned seamlessly from TV to film, a feat that was notoriously difficult at the time. He starred in The Great Escape alongside Steve McQueen, holding his own among a cast of bold personalities. In the Americanization of Emily, he showed he could handle dramatic material with depth and intelligence. And in comedies like Support Your Local Sheriff, his timing was impeccable. Never overplayed, always just right. But Garner's most iconic role, at least for television audiences, was yet to come. In the 1970s, he stepped into the shoes of Jim Rockford, a scruffy, sardonic private investigator living out of a trailer in the Rockford Files. Rockford wasn't slick or invincible. He got beat up, he owed people money, he didn't even like being a detective half the time, but he was clever, persistent, and had an unshakable moral compass. The role fit Garner like a glove. He brought a raw, worn-down realism to Rockford that made the character timeless. Despite the fame that followed, Garner never let Hollywood reshape who he was. He didn't chase the spotlight, and he didn't play the celebrity game. Colleagues often remarked that he was the same man off screen as he was on. Humble, generous, and just a little bit mischievous. He hated phoniness. He didn't suffer egos, and he believed that kindness and decency mattered more than marquee status or awards. Garner once said, "I'm not a big deal. I'm just an actor who shows up, knows his lines, and tells the truth." And in many ways, that summed him up. For all the leading roles, accolades, and television history he helped write, he stayed grounded. While others were reinventing themselves for the sake of image, Garner stuck to what felt real. That honesty, not just in his performances, but in the way he lived, was what truly set him apart. As his star rose, he didn't lose touch with his roots. He wasn't interested in becoming Hollywood royalty. He wanted to work, do it well, and go home to his wife and daughter. Fame wasn't the goal. It was just a side effect of doing what he loved with integrity. And maybe that's why his performances still resonate. Because behind that iconic smile was a man who never pretended to be anything he wasn't. In a town where relationships flicker and fade under the spotlight, James Garner's love story stood quietly defiant. It didn't begin with a script, a studio, or a red carpet. It started simply at a barbecue in 1956. That's where he met Lois Clark, an elegant, free-spirited woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper wit. Their connection was immediate, electric, and undeniable. Just 2 weeks after their first conversation, they got married. 16 days from hello to I do. Even in Hollywood, that was fast. But to Garner, there was no doubt. He later joked, "We had dinner every night for 14 nights, and I just couldn't get enough of her. I knew I didn't want to go a day without seeing her face." While others might call it impulsive, he called it fate. That whirlwind courtship would turn into a nearly 58-year-long marriage, one that outlasted the glitter, the gossip, and the grind of the industry around them. When James married Lois, he didn't just become a husband. He also became a father figure. Lois had a young daughter, Kim, who was 9 years old and recovering from polio. Stepping into that role wasn't something Garner did reluctantly or out of obligation. He did it with a full heart. He treated Kim as his own from the beginning, and their bond remained strong for decades. 2 years into the marriage, Garner and Lois welcomed a daughter of their own, Greta Gigi Garner, born in 1958. From day one, Garner took his role as a father seriously. While he could be tough when necessary, he was mostly known for his warmth, humor, and unwavering presence. He wasn't the distant celebrity dad. He was at home, often in jeans and a flannel shirt, helping with homework, making breakfast, or sneaking in a game of catch in the yard. Marriage, like life, wasn't always smooth. Garner never pretended otherwise. The couple went through difficult patches, including 2 significant separations, once in 1970 and again in 1979. Those breaks in their relationship were painful, but not driven by betrayal or bitterness. They were, in Garner's own words, times of exhaustion and emotional wear. "Hollywood can wear you down," he once admitted. "Sometimes you just need to step back to remember what matters." During those times apart, he retreated, not into scandal, but into solitude. He spent time in Canada and rented a house in the San Fernando Valley, trying to find a rhythm outside of the intense pressure his career had created. But even during the distance, the connection between James and Lois didn't truly break. Letters, phone calls, visits, they stayed in each other's lives, orbiting like 2 magnets always drawn back together. In 1981, after their second separation, they quietly reunited. No fanfare, no headlines, just 2 people who had weathered storms and found their way back to calmer waters. That reconciliation wasn't just a resumption, it was a recommitment. Garner understood that love wasn't about perfection or fairy tales. It was about showing up, even after time apart, with your heart still in the right place. Throughout it all, Garner never shied away from crediting Lois for the strength of their union. She brought balance to his life, offered perspective when the business became overwhelming, and kept their family grounded in ways no agent or manager ever could. Her influence extended beyond the home, too. Lois was Jewish, and while Garner wasn't religious himself, he always respected and supported her traditions. He believed in celebrating what mattered to her, because it mattered to him by extension. It wasn't about faith, it was about love and acceptance. Garner once summed up his view of marriage with the kind of humor only he could pull off. Marriage is like the army. Everyone complains, but a surprising number of people re-enlist. That quote, delivered with a grin and a wink, carried more truth than it let on. For Garner, marriage wasn't about idealism. It was about persistence, loyalty, and shared laughter across the years. And perhaps that's why it endured. Not because it was flawless, but because it was real. In a world where fame so often overshadows family, James Garner remained an exception. His marriage to Lois Clark wasn't a perfect love story. It was a human one, full of passion, patience, and a quiet, steady kind of devotion that Hollywood rarely remembers. But Garner never needed Hollywood to validate his love. He lived it, every single day. By the time the Rockford Files premiered in 1974, James Garner was already a familiar face to television audiences. But no one, not even Garner himself, could have predicted just how iconic the series would become. As private investigator Jim Rockford, he brought a perfect blend of charm, cynicism, and underdog grit. Audiences loved him. The show became a staple of primetime television. Critics praised it. Ratings soared. And behind every episode was James Garner, anchoring the show with unwavering charisma. But while the world saw a confident, quick-witted detective dodging danger and delivering dry one-liners, the reality behind the scenes was far more grueling. Garner wasn't just the star of the Rockford Files, he was the engine. He appeared in nearly every scene, did many of his own stunts, and carried the weight of the series on his back, literally and figuratively. That workload came at a steep cost. Week after week, the tight filming schedule pushed him to his physical limits. The show's action-heavy format, complete with fistfights, car chases, and stunt work, took a brutal toll on his body. Garner's knees, already battered from years of physical work, began to deteriorate rapidly. He endured multiple surgeries, cortisone shots, and constant pain just to make it through the day. There were times he could barely stand between takes, yet when the cameras rolled, he never let it show. But it wasn't just his body that suffered. The emotional and mental stress of the series, particularly his battles with the network over working conditions and creative decisions, began to wear him down. Garner was known for standing his ground, especially when he felt the crew or the show's quality were being compromised. He pushed back against unrealistic deadlines, budget cuts, and overwork. And while that made him a hero to many working alongside him, it also left him drained. By 1979, the weight became too much. Garner made the difficult decision to step away from the Rockford Files. It wasn't a matter of ego or creative disinterest. It was necessity. His body was breaking down, and his spirit was depleted. He later said, "I wasn't quitting Rockford. I was quitting pain." The show had made him a star all over again, but at the cost of his health and peace of mind. Around this time, his personal life began to show signs of strain as well. Garner and his wife Lois, who had weathered so much together already, entered another period of separation. It wasn't driven by scandal or betrayal, but by sheer exhaustion. The endless demands of filming had created a distance, emotional and physical, that neither of them had wanted but could no longer ignore. Garner retreated for a time, spending periods alone in Canada and renting a modest home in the San Fernando Valley. It was his way of hitting pause, of seeking silence in a life that had become too loud. Still, even during that separation, he never spoke ill of Lois. On the contrary, he consistently emphasized that their time apart wasn't about a lack of love. It was about survival. He needed space to heal, not from her, but from everything else. And Lois, ever understanding, gave him that space. In September of 1981, after 2 years of distance, they quietly reconciled. No dramatic declarations or public announcements, just a return to the life they'd built together, piece by piece. Their reunion wasn't a restart, it was a reminder that even after time apart, what they had was strong enough to hold steady. Looking back, Garner never regretted his time on the Rockford Files. It had given him one of the most defining roles of his career, but it also taught him the value of balance, of rest, of saying no before breaking down completely. He carried those lessons into the rest of his life and career, choosing future roles more carefully, managing his time with greater intention, and always putting his health and his family ahead of the next big project. What the audience never saw was the man between the takes, the one icing his knees after long days, lying awake at night under the pressure, wondering how long he could keep pushing through. What they did see was a master of his craft, making it all look easy. That was the brilliance of James Garner. He bore the weight so gracefully, no one ever saw him strain. Amid the chaos of Hollywood, where extravagance and attention-seeking architecture often scream for the spotlight, James Garner created something very different. A quiet sanctuary in the hills of Brentwood. It wasn't just a house. It was a personal retreat, a private world built not for show, but for peace. In 1966, as his star continued to rise, Garner and his wife Lois made a choice that said everything about who they were. Instead of chasing glitz, they commissioned renowned modernist architects Buff and Hensman to design their dream home. Known for their clean lines, honest materials, and harmony with nature, Buff and Hensman created a residence that reflected Garner's essence, understated, elegant, and effortlessly cool. Set on nearly an acre of land and wrapped in mature trees and open sky, the Brentwood property was more than real estate. It was a refuge. The home featured expansive glass walls, open living spaces, and an easy flow between indoors and out. Natural light filled every room. The surrounding landscape became part of the home itself, blurring the line between structure and setting. Inside, there were no dramatic flourishes or over-the-top design choices, just thoughtful simplicity. Polished wood, stone accents, and subtle touches of mid-century design gave the space a timeless feel. Garner didn't need chandeliers or gold-plated fixtures. He needed comfort, calm, and a place where he could just be James, not Jim Rockford or Brett Maverick. The house was a haven for his family. Whether it was breakfast around the kitchen table, quiet evenings with Lois, or backyard barbecues with friends and neighbors, the Brentwood home was where life happened. Real life, far from the flashbulbs. It was where Garner could unwind, let his guard down, and be present for the moments that mattered most. He spent nearly 5 decades in that home. It saw birthdays, anniversaries, heartbreaks, reconciliations, and everything in between. Through all the seasons of his life, career highs, personal challenges, health battles, that house remained constant, a safe place in an unpredictable world. Despite his fame, Garner kept his home life fiercely private. There were no tabloid tours or reality show cameras. Few people outside his circle even knew what the inside of his house looked like. That wasn't by accident. He protected that space with the same quiet strength he brought to his best roles. When Garner passed away in 2014, the house didn't become a spectacle. There were no estate sales or media spotlights. It remained just as he left it, calm, quiet, filled with memories. For years, it stood untouched, a living time capsule of the man who once walked its halls. Eventually, in March 2020, the Brentwood property was sold in a private off-market transaction for $10 million. It was a quiet ending for a quiet place. No fanfare, no bidding war headlines. Just the discreet transfer of a home built not to impress the world, but to protect what Garner valued most. Even in its sale, the house remained consistent with the values he lived by: simplicity, dignity, and discretion. It wasn't just a roof over his head, it was a reflection of his soul. While the world saw a leading man, this was the space where he was simply a husband, a father, a neighbor, and a man at peace with himself. In an industry defined by illusion, Garner's home told the truth. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, it was real. And in many ways, it remains the most authentic monument to his legacy. Not made of marble, but of wood, stone, glass, and love. A house that, like the man who lived in it, stood with quiet confidence through the decades. As James Garner entered the later chapters of his life, he began to seek something more than just rest between roles. He wanted space, real, open, uninterrupted space. Somewhere far from the deadlines, the contracts, and the endless city noise. That longing led him north, to California's serene Santa Ynez Valley, a place of wide skies, rolling vineyards, and time that moved a little slower. There, nestled between the hills and shaded by ancient oaks, Garner found his escape. A 400-acre parcel of untouched land became the canvas for what would become his personal Eden. It wasn't about luxury for luxury's sake, it was about breathing room, about finding silence in a world that rarely allowed it. To design the home he envisioned, Garner turned to acclaimed architect Hugh Newell Jacobson. Known for his modernist vision and deep respect for landscape, Jacobson created a house that was both bold and reverent. The structure, nearly 8,000 square feet, wasn't a mansion in the traditional sense. It was a gathering of clean lines, tall gables, and sun-drenched rooms. A series of pavilions connected like a modern-day village, surrounded by the rhythms of nature. The home seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Nothing about it felt out of place. Inside, the design embraced openness and light. Minimalist yet warm, the spaces flowed into one another, allowing the outside world to filter through every window and wall. Garner didn't want to shut out the land. He wanted to live with it. And live with it he did. The ranch became his second great sanctuary. While Brentwood was his private base in the city, Santa Ynez was where he could truly let go. No scripts, no meetings, just early morning walks, long drives through the valley, and nights under stars that city lights never let you see. The property wasn't just for solitude either. Garner spent weekends there with family and close friends. It was where his daughter, Gigi, remembered seeing her father truly unwind, smiling, unhurried, at peace. Whether tending to the land, watching the horses graze, or simply sitting on the patio with Lois as the sun dipped behind the hills, this was the version of Garner few ever got to see. Not the star, not the icon. Just a man in his element. He appreciated the balance. City life fed his work, but this ranch fed his soul. It reminded him of his Oklahoma roots, where land meant freedom and silence was a kind of music. Here, he didn't have to perform. In time, however, life moved on. In 2000, after years of memories and moments, Garner made the decision to sell the ranch. The 400-acre estate changed hands for $8.75 million, a significant amount, but the value went far beyond the price tag. For Garner, the sale marked the closing of a personal chapter. He had built something beautiful, lived in it fully, and then let it go with grace. He didn't speak much about the sale publicly. That wasn't his style. But those close to him understood. He had created a refuge when he needed it, and now it was time to pass it on. What remained was not the land itself, but the life that had unfolded on it. Garner's time in Santa Ynez wasn't just a retreat, it was a reflection. It captured the side of him that fame never touched. The man who loved nature, who valued silence over applause, who found more joy in a quiet evening with family than a front-row seat at an awards show. The ranch, like his Brentwood home, was never about appearances. It wasn't a celebrity flex or an architectural statement. It was a place of comfort, intention, and peace. A sanctuary built by someone who had spent decades in front of the camera, only to find his truest self far away from the lens. And though the property now belongs to someone else, its spirit, the quiet beauty, the stillness, the light through the trees, will always carry a trace of the man who once called it home. For all the charm and confidence James Garner brought to the screen, there was a physical toll quietly mounting behind the scenes. A lifetime of stunts, long days on set, and a stubborn commitment to doing the hard stuff himself had left its mark. Long before Hollywood embraced stunt doubles and body doubles as the norm, Garner was out there throwing punches, taking falls, and hitting the pavement, literally. And it caught up with him. His knees were the first to betray him. During the demanding run of the Rockford Files, Garner pushed himself through car chases, fight scenes, and stunt work that would have challenged even a younger man. He did it all with grit, but not without consequence. The cartilage wore down, the joints swelled, and eventually, the pain became constant. He underwent multiple knee surgeries, each more invasive than the last, just to keep moving. At one point, he had so many procedures that he lost count. In 2000, the damage had finally reached a breaking point. Garner underwent a double knee replacement, a major surgery for anyone, let alone someone in his 70s. But he faced it the way he faced most things, head-on, without drama. Recovery wasn't easy. It was slow, painful, and humbling. But Garner never complained. He once joked that his knees had aged 20 years faster than the rest of him, and then got on with it. But the pain in his legs wasn't the only thing threatening his health. Years of chain smoking, a habit picked up in his youth, followed him well into adulthood. He'd started smoking when he was just 12 years old, long before anyone truly understood the consequences. And even after his doctors pleaded with him to quit, Garner struggled. The habit was deeply ingrained, a crutch during stress, a companion during long days on set. Then came 1988. Garner was rushed into surgery for a quintuple bypass, 5 blocked arteries, 1 heart struggling to keep up. It was a serious, life-threatening moment. For many, it would have been a final warning. But even after the successful operation, he kept smoking. 17 more years. It wasn't until 2005, after decades of false starts, that he finally let the cigarettes go. His daughter, Gigi, would later say, "My dad smoked for most of his life, but when he quit for good. He had that kind of willpower, quiet but unbreakable." Then, in 2008, another blow. Garner suffered a massive stroke. It was the kind of event that can end everything: mobility, speech, even the ability to recognize the people you love. But once again, he fought his way back. Just days after emergency surgery, his recovery surprised even the doctors. He worked hard to regain what the stroke had taken, and while he never fully returned to the public eye in the same way, he was still James, still sharp, still kind, still laughing when it would have been easier to despair. That was the thing about him. He never wore his suffering on his sleeve. He didn't use pain as an excuse. or try to earn sympathy with his struggles. He kept going. When his knees ached, he showed up. When his heart faltered, he healed. When a stroke tried to silence him, he found a way to keep speaking, even if it was just through his presence, his spirit, and his eyes. Garner's resilience wasn't the dramatic kind. It didn't come with swelling music or inspirational speeches. It was quiet, steady, day-by-day perseverance. He endured so much, and yet never lost his warmth, never lost the humor that made people feel instantly at ease, never lost the humility that made him one of the most respected men in Hollywood. Behind the curtain of charisma and cool, James Garner lived with pain. Real pain. But he carried it with grace and never let it define him. He was, in the truest sense, a man of strength. Not because he was invincible, but because he kept going even when it hurt. And through it all, he remained the same man his family loved, his friends admired, and his fans cherished. Not because he played heroes on screen, but because he was quietly heroic in real life. On the quiet evening of July 19, 2014, in his beloved Brentwood home, James Garner took his final breath. The man who had spent over 5 decades captivating audiences with his wit, charm, and authenticity passed away peacefully at the age of 86. The cause was a heart attack, the result of long-standing coronary artery disease, a battle he had been fighting privately for years. It was a quiet end, far from the spotlight he had so often sidestepped, in the place he cherished most. The news of his passing rippled across the world. From Hollywood to homes where the Rockford Files reruns played like comfort food, people mourned. Garner wasn't just a star. They had grown up with him. He was the smooth-talking gambler in Maverick, the wisecracking detective who never pulled a gun unless he had to, the gentle, devoted husband in The Notebook. For many, he felt like a friend they never met. Someone you could trust, someone who seemed real. Tributes came pouring in from all corners of the industry. Actors, directors, writers, people who had worked with him or simply admired him, shared stories not of ego or stardom, but of kindness, integrity, warmth. Tom Selleck, who had looked up to Garner both as a performer and a man, spoke with clear emotion. "Jim wasn't just a mentor to me, he was a friend, a true professional. Watching him work taught me more than any class or script ever could." They had shared the screen on the Rockford Files, but their connection went beyond characters. Selleck saw in Garner a blueprint for how to carry success with humility. Sally Field, who had starred opposite Garner in Murphy's Romance, was shaken by the loss. "My heart just broke," she said. "There are so few people on this planet I've adored as much as Jimmy Garner. I treasure every moment I had with him." The chemistry they shared on screen wasn't crafted. It was genuine. Field often spoke of how he made her laugh, how he made her feel safe, how his presence alone could steady a scene or a soul. Even Clint Eastwood, known for his own stoic brand of leading man, offered heartfelt words. He and Garner had crossed paths in the early television days and later on the big screen in Space Cowboys. "Jim paved the way for guys like me," Eastwood said. "He was the everyman hero. He showed that you didn't have to shout to be strong. You didn't have to dominate to lead. You could just be real." That was the legacy Garner left behind. Not just a catalog of great roles, but a new mold of manhood. One built on quiet confidence, decency, and respect. For others, for the craft, and for himself. 7 years later, in October 2021, Lois Clark passed away at the age of 98. The woman who had stood beside him through every peak and valley. who had been his partner, his anchor, and his safe harbor, was finally reunited with him. They had weathered life's storms hand in hand, even when apart. Their nearly 6-decade-long love story had its scars, but it endured, genuine, resilient, and rare. With her passing, a chapter truly closed. Their home was now silent, their shared stories finished. But the echo of their life together still lingers. In interviews, in memories, in the photographs tucked into old albums, and in the way people still talk about them with admiration. James Garner didn't exit this world with a spotlight on him. There was no grand farewell tour, no dramatic last words. Just the end of a life lived on his own terms, in the company of those who truly mattered to him. And in many ways, that's exactly how he would have wanted it. The final chapter of James Garner's life wasn't written with applause, but with peace, with dignity, with love, and with the kind of legacy that doesn't fade because it wasn't built on image, it was built on character. James Garner may have played laid-back, easygoing characters on screen, but behind that relaxed smile was a sharp, quietly strategic mind. He understood the business of Hollywood better than most, and unlike many of his peers, he didn't just ride the wave of fame, he made sure he owned part of the ocean. While others got caught up in the glitz, Garner kept his eye on something more lasting: control, fairness, and long-term security. Beyond television, Garner was just as smart about diversifying his career. He became the face of Mazda in the 1980s and 1990s, starring in a series of commercials that capitalized on his down-to-earth image and trustworthy persona. His voice, both warm and authoritative, became a staple in advertising and narration work. Documentaries, specials, commercials. If James Garner was speaking, people listened. He didn't chase trends. He chose projects carefully, took care of his finances, and made smart decisions about where to invest his time and energy. And while he could have lived like royalty, he didn't. Garner was known for his modest lifestyle. He didn't splurge on yachts or diamond-studded watches. Instead, he invested in real estate, like his longtime Brentwood home and his beloved Santa Ynez Ranch, both of which quietly appreciated over the years. At the time of his death in 2014, Garner's net worth was estimated at around $20 million. Not because he grabbed every role or endorsement that came his way, but because he worked smart, stayed grounded, and never lost sight of the bigger picture. He understood that fame was fleeting, but smart decisions lasted. For someone so deeply admired for his humility, it's easy to overlook just how savvy Garner really was. But behind the charm was a man who read every contract, stood up for what was right, and built a legacy not just on screen, but in boardrooms, courtrooms, and balance sheets. He wasn't just a talented actor, he was a thoughtful businessman, a quiet revolutionary in an industry that rarely plays fair. James Garner proved that you could be kind and assertive, humble and strong, generous and fiercely intelligent. And in doing so, he showed that success doesn't have to come at the cost of your soul. You just have to know your worth and never be afraid to demand it. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines faded, what James Garner left behind wasn't defined by awards or box office numbers. It was something much quieter and far more lasting. His legacy wasn't built in studio lots or sound stages. It lived in the places he called home, the spaces he built not to impress, but to simply be. For nearly 50 years, his Brentwood home was a steady presence, a modernist gem tucked away in one of Los Angeles's most private enclaves. Designed in the 1960s by Buff and Hensman, the home stood as an extension of Garner himself, refined, modest, and deeply intentional. It wasn't grand in the Hollywood sense, but it didn't need to be. Every detail, every window, every stone was chosen with care. It was the kind of place where life unfolded slowly, honestly, where memories were made not for cameras, but for family. After Garner's passing in 2014, the house remained with his loved ones for several years. It wasn't rushed to market or turned into a media spectacle. It sat quietly, just as he had always wanted, untouched, sacred, a time capsule of a man who valued peace over pretense. Then, in March 2020, the home was sold quietly in an off-market transaction for $10 million. No press tour, no dramatic listing, just a simple, graceful goodbye to a place that had meant everything. 2 decades earlier, in 2000, Garner had parted with his Santa Ynez Ranch, the sprawling 400-acre retreat that had given him room to breathe. That sale, too, was carried out with discretion. By then, the land had served its purpose. It had given him peace, offered sanctuary, and grounded him when the weight of fame grew too heavy. Letting it go wasn't a loss, it was a closing chapter, a life lived fully and with intention. Both properties, the serene Brentwood home and the sun-drenched Santa Ynez Ranch, reflected the core of who James Garner truly was. They weren't sets or props or symbols of status. They were built from a deep need for calm, for privacy, for something real. And in those spaces, he lived his truest life. Not as a Hollywood star, but as a husband, a father, a friend, as a man. When people remember James Garner, they remember the roles, of course. The smooth gambler, the reluctant hero, the private eye with a dry sense of humor and a heart of gold. But those characters were just echoes of a much deeper truth. What made him special wasn't what he played. It was how he lived. He didn't chase the spotlight. He didn't need red carpets or magazine covers to validate his worth. Instead, he chose something far more rare in show business: authenticity. He chose simplicity over spectacle, kindness over ego, and love over legacy. And in doing so, he became unforgettable. Not because he demanded attention, but because he earned respect. His homes may now belong to others, their walls repainted, their gardens replanted. But the spirit of those places, the quiet, the grace, the warmth, still holds something of him. You can't sell that. You can't measure it in dollars or square footage. It lingers, soft as a memory, deep as a footprint in earth. James Garner's story ends not with noise, but with stillness. Not with flashbulbs, but with the echo of a door gently closing behind a life well lived. In a world obsessed with the spotlight, James Garner chose something else. He chose love. He chose family. He chose truth. And in that choice, he became something rare. Not just a legend, but a man worth remembering.